Hi everyone, Kevin Benison here, back with video 3 out of the 5-day series I'm doing on helping you understand some of the requirements of the Lifting Operations and Lifting Equipment Regulations, or LOLER 1998. Sometimes the language within the regulations is a bit tricky for people to understand, and there are many questions that go around about what is actually legal requirement and what isn't. So this is just helping you to understand a little bit more by me breaking down what the regulation actually requires. Yesterday, we had a look on video 2, we had a look on strength and stability in Regulation 4. And today, on this video, we're going to talk about Regulation 9, which is thorough examination. So firstly, just understanding what the purpose of thorough examination actually is. Well, thorough examination is required because it's there to look for any structural defects or weaknesses that are likely to potentially affect the safety or the strength of, or the integrity of the equipment, and are unlikely to be picked up by the user, i.e. the operator, in their standard checks. So things like any kind of metal fatigue, or any narrowing of circular rounded components such as chain links perhaps, or indeed things like fractures or cracks or any deep corrosion. Now of course a crane is something that's there's a weight applied to it, force applied to it regularly and then released. And we know what happens when you get a bit of metal and bend that back and forth many times. So that's what you're doing with the crane. And over time, there's the potential of metal fatigue. Of course, things like chains, they're constantly being stretched and then going back to their original position. So that could result in fatigue over time. So this is really what examination is looking for, these kind of things. It's also there to ensure that the safety systems are calibrated correctly. Things like the radius indicator and the rated capacity indicator, and the load cell that's on the equipment, just that's within a specified tolerance of accuracy. So that's what the purpose of examination is. Now, what may be included within examination? Well, of course, things like measurements and calibration, actually checking the thickness of components or the steel to ensure that it hasn't narrowed or worn too much. Also measuring out things like the radius with the measuring tape and making sure that the indicator reads the same. So some of the measuring instruments on the crane may need to be calibrated as a result of examination. Then of course, doing perhaps things like load testing. Now, there are different words that are used within the industry, and they do have different meanings. There's inspection, examination, test, and indeed check. Well, check is something that the operator is pretty much doing on a daily basis. Now, the word test indicates that something is being done to verify the function or perhaps the strength of equipment. Now, load testing is usually only done when necessary, perhaps after major structural repair. People will often use the term testing when it comes to, say, a set of chains. They'll say they're due for test, when in actual fact, they don't get tested, they just get examined, visually. So sometimes testing may be required, load testing may be required, but usually that's just to essentially verify after work has been done, or if there is another reason that the competent person feels it necessary. Some equipment still gets load tested periodically, and that's standard practice. But things like mobile cranes, the manufacturers and indeed codes of practice have viewed it that there are more detrimental effects to overload testing than there are benefits. So it tends not to be done. Non-destructive testing may be carried out as part of thorough examination, or the examiner may specify that it's necessary to do non-destructive testing. So non-destructive is, as it suggests, it's not detrimental to the equipment, but it may be things like electromagnetic testing or dye-penetrant testing or X-ray, just to see whether there's any fractures, hairline cracks, or indeed any deformation inside the steel. Also then, moving on, looking at who does the thorough examination. So it has to be done by an authorised, competent person. Well, authorised speaks for itself, they've actually been given the permission, the authority to do the examination. And competent in this context essentially means somebody with the necessary practical and theoretical knowledge and experience to enable them to identify defects or weaknesses. They're adequately qualified. So they've got the experience to pick up, they know what they're looking for, they know the signs, they'll understand about the history of the equipment. Now, also with that, there's a question that often gets raised about, does it have to be somebody who's independent? No, it doesn't. LOLER doesn't require that. Within the guidance of LOLER, it says that somebody can do this as long as they can act with the necessary independence. They can be within the organisation, as long as they're going to then produce their findings and their results in the report without fear nor favour. So essentially, they're not worried about what the company may say because of the outcome of their report, or they're not like favouring the company by saying something will be okay just so the equipment can go back to work. So do they have the necessary autonomy, if you like, the authority to be able to do that if they're working for the company? Well, many will, and many companies are set up with a culture that actually promotes that autonomy. So it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody independent. But in many cases, insurance companies will specify that they actually, they specify who the competent person will be. It'll be somebody that's then contracted on their behalf to do it, or somebody that works as part of the insurance company, perhaps. And then looking at when does the examination get done? So when do thorough examinations have to be done? Well, there are a few times that LOLER specifies that examination has to be done. One is before first use. Now that essentially means when simply a company purchases a piece of lifting equipment. So they buy a crane, for example. Before they put that crane to work, they need to carry out thorough examination. Now there are exceptions to that. One of those exceptions is if it has a declaration of conformity, an EC declaration of conformity, which was produced within the previous 12 months and the equipment has not been used before, then it doesn't need to be examined before it goes to work. For example, the equipment's brand new, or you've just bought it from the manufacturer and it's been sitting in their warehouse for a few months, but it's not been used, it's not gone into service. So therefore, the declaration of conformity was done, let's say 6-7 months ago, the equipment's not been used, you can put it straight to work. Another exception is if there's physical evidence of it having been examined within the past 12 months. Now, this is something I would advise to proceed with caution, simply because unless you can be absolutely sure of the integrity of the organisation, the person that's done that examination, you would probably be best getting it examined yourself before you put it to work. I wouldn't personally want to buy equipment and just rely on a certificate or a report that states that it's been thoroughly examined. I would feel a lot more comfortable getting it examined myself or as the organisation before putting it to work. So just be careful on that one. Another time, of course, is LOLER then recommends 12 monthly, or it specifies 12 monthly minimum. Now, these periods LOLER puts down, but says it always needs to come within an examination scheme which is drawn up by the competent person. So although LOLER sets out these periodic intervals, it's still saying that somebody needs to deem whether or not they are suitable for the type of equipment and the application being used. For example, if you're using equipment on high cycle work, it's lifting a lot more than the manufacturer anticipates it would, it may need to be thoroughly examined more frequently. It may be doing like 24-hour work of a lot of lifts. So perhaps it needs to be thoroughly examined more frequently than what LOLER lays down as that 12 monthly period. So 12 monthly if it's not being used to lift persons. So just for material lifting only. Then 6 monthly for any equipment that's been used to lift persons. So that's important to consider that a crane would normally be 12 monthly, but if you're going to use it to lift people, then it has to be thoroughly examined at least 6 monthly. Of course, something like a MUP, a mobile elevated work platform, or a cherry picker as you may call it, needs to be thoroughly examined every 6 months as a minimum. Also, lifting accessories, so your slings, shackles, chains, spreader beams, all these things that go essentially between the hook and the load need to be thoroughly examined at least every 6 months. And then, of course, there's the requirement to thoroughly examine equipment after assembly at a new site or location. So the best example of that is a tower crane. You take it down, you put it elsewhere, even if it's on another location on site. Because of it being erected again, it must be thoroughly examined to ensure that it has been erected correctly. And then the final one, after any exceptional circumstances that could jeopardise the safety of the equipment. So if you think about the equipment as being exposed to high winds or a lightning strike, or it's been involved in collision, or certainly things like overturn, or it was shock loaded, these kind of things, then you would go, okay, well, there's something that could have caused damage to the equipment there. We need to thoroughly examine it before we allow it to go back to work. So that's just a bit of an overview of LOLER Regulation 9 in this third video in a series of 5. Tomorrow we'll be back with video 4, which will be on lifting persons, which is always a hot topic. So look forward to that one. And in the meantime, if you have any comments, put them below. And of course, make sure you follow us and subscribe so you get these next videos and indeed any further videos in the future. But bye for now and safe lifting.